When I moved into this neighborhood, I thought I had found the perfect place to start a new chapter in my life. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges, the houses were picturesque, and the community seemed friendly, at least on the surface. As I unloaded my boxes, I was greeted by an older man with sharp, calculating eyes and an overly enthusiastic smile. "Welcome to our HOA community. I'm Mr. Wallace, the president," he said, extending a hand that felt a little too firm. He immediately launched into a speech about the neighborhood's standards and rules, emphasizing how he expected homeowners to maintain the integrity of the community. Something about his tone unsettled me, but I brushed it off as typical HOA strictness. However, it didn't take long before I noticed something off. Wallace always seemed to be outside, watching. Whether I was coming home from work, taking out the trash, or simply stepping onto my porch for fresh air, his piercing gaze followed me. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence, but the frequency of his appearances became impossible to ignore. Then came the letters. Thinly veiled warnings about minor things like my trash cans being an inch too close to the curb or my porch light being too bright. It was unsettling, but I wasn't breaking any actual rules. My discomfort turned to genuine concern when I caught him standing near my backyard fence at night, peering through the slats. That was the breaking point. I decided to install security cameras around my property, not to spy on my neighbors, but to ensure my own safety. The next morning, I woke up to an angry knock on my door. Wallace stood there, red-faced and fuming. "I noticed you installed cameras," he stated flatly. "That's against HOA regulations." I raised an eyebrow. I checked the bylaws. There's no rule against private security cameras on my property. His jaw clenched. "Well, it's invasive. We maintain a certain atmosphere here." That's when it hit me. He wasn't concerned about aesthetics or privacy. He was upset because now he was being watched. I refused to take them down, and that's when the real nightmare began. Wallace started showing up more frequently, standing on the sidewalk just outside my property, staring at the cameras as if willing them to disappear. My mailbox began filling up with violation notices, each more ridiculous than the last. He even tried to turn my neighbors against me, warning them that my surveillance was an invasion of their privacy. But the real terror came one night when I checked my security footage and saw Wallace lurking in my yard at 2 a.m., inspecting the cameras, his face twisted in frustration. My blood ran cold. It was clear this wasn't about the HOA anymore. This was personal. From the moment I caught Mr. Wallace on my security camera prowling around my yard in the dead of night, I knew I had entered battle far worse than just a petty HOA dispute. It was no longer about my security cameras. It was about control. Wallace wanted absolute authority over this neighborhood, and I had unknowingly become his biggest threat. The next morning, I woke up to a bright yellow notice plastered to my front door. HOA violation was stamped in bold, accusing me of unauthorized modifications to my property. According to the letter, my security cameras were disrupting the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I scoffed. Aesthetic harmony? The cameras were small, barely noticeable, installed on my private property. But I wasn't surprised. Wallace was retaliating, and this was just the beginning. I decided to confront him directly. I walked over to his house, an imposing, pristine 2-story home with a garden so meticulously trimmed it felt almost artificial. When he opened the door, he was already smirking, as if he had been expecting me. "I assume you got my notice?" he said, crossing his arms. "Yeah, and I'm not taking the cameras down," I replied firmly. "They're for my safety. You of all people should understand that." His expression darkened. "We have rules in this community. If you don't comply, you'll be fined. Heavily. How exactly do my security cameras violate any actual rule?" I challenged. "I read the bylaws, and there's nothing in there about private security." His smirk returned, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. "We reserve the right to enforce new regulations as needed. I'll be proposing an amendment at the next HOA meeting. Your cameras will be banned." I clenched my fists. "You can't just change rules because you don't like something." "Oh, but I can," he said smoothly. "I have the full support of this community." It was a bluff, and I knew it, but that didn't mean he wouldn't try. I returned home, seething, but I wasn't about to back down. A war begins. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. First, the fines started rolling in, ridiculous amounts, sometimes multiple notices in a single day. I ignored them. Then, my trash mysteriously wasn't picked up. My mailbox was suddenly out of compliance with some obscure HOA rule, and I was threatened with another fine if I didn't replace it with an approved design. It wasn't just the official notices either. My car tires were mysteriously deflated one morning. My Wi-Fi started cutting out at random hours. And worst of all, my cameras picked up footage of someone wearing a hood, but unmistakably shaped like Wallace, spraying a sticky, glue-like substance on my front door handle at night. I reported all of this to police, but without hard evidence linking it directly to Wallace, there wasn't much they could do. Then one of my neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Caldwell, knocked on my door one evening. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside. "You need to be careful," she whispered. "Wallace is dangerous." I was already aware of that, but hearing it from a long-time resident made it even more unsettling. "He's done this before," she continued. "Any time someone questions his authority, he finds a way to drive them out. He forced the Parkers to sell their house last year by fining them into bankruptcy. And the Johnsons? They had cameras, too. Their house mysteriously caught fire a few weeks later. A chill ran down my spine. Are you saying Wallace burned down their house?" She hesitated. "I don't have proof, but he made their lives miserable until they left. And then, poof, gone." I exhaled sharply. I knew Wallace was corrupt, but arson? That was a whole new level. Why does everyone let him get away with this? I asked. She shook her head sadly. Because he has power, connections, and most people are too scared to fight back. But I wasn't. I had let Wallace push me around for long enough. Fighting back. The next HOA meeting was in a week, and I knew I had to be prepared. I started documenting everything: the fines, the vandalism, the harassment. I even installed an extra hidden camera disguised as a decorative light, hoping to catch something definitive. Then, just days before the meeting, my worst fear came true. I woke up to the sound of glass shattering. I bolted out of bed, my heart pounding, and rushed to my living room. One of my front windows had been smashed. A brick lay on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass. I immediately checked my security footage. And there he was, Wallace, in the middle of the night, sneaking onto my property and hurling the brick through my window. This was the proof I needed. I called the police, and this time they took it seriously. They reviewed the footage and promised to investigate. But I wasn't going to wait for them to act. I had my own plans for the HOA meeting. The meeting from hell. The HOA meetings were usually held in the neighborhood clubhouse, a fancy space meant for approved gatherings. When I arrived, the room was packed. Wallace stood at the front, smug as ever, clearly expecting to pass his ban on security cameras without opposition. But he hadn't counted on me. I waited patiently as he droned on about community values and privacy concerns, painting me as a villain for daring to install cameras. Then, when he finally called for a vote, I stood up. "Before we vote," I said loudly, "I think the community should see something." I pulled out my laptop and connected it to the projector. The room fell silent as I played the footage, clear as day, of Wallace sneaking onto my property and throwing the brick through my window. Gasps echoed through the room. Wallace's face drained of color. What is this?" he stammered. "It's evidence," I said, my voice steady. "Evidence of harassment, vandalism, and abuse of power." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Neighbors who'd been too afraid to speak up were now whispering, questioning. Then Mrs. Caldwell stood up. "He did the same thing to the Parkers," she shouted. "And the Johnsons." Others followed. One by one, my neighbors began recounting their own stories of Wallace's bullying, his fabricated violations, his threats. Wallace tried to regain control. "This is ridiculous. None of this is true." But it was too late. The community had finally turned against him. By the end of the night, a vote was called, not to ban security cameras, but to remove Wallace from his position as HOA president. It passed overwhelmingly. The next day, The police arrested Wallace for vandalism and trespassing. As it turned out, my footage was the final piece of evidence they needed to take him down. I stood on my porch, watching as they hauled him away in handcuffs. For the first time since moving here, I finally felt safe. But more than that, I had won. Even though Wallace had been arrested, I knew the battle wasn't over. Corrupt men like him didn't just disappear quietly. They clawed and schemed their way back if given the chance. I had learned that firsthand. The night after his arrest, I sat on my porch, taking in the silence of the neighborhood. It was the first time in months that I didn't feel like I was being watched. But just as I started to relax, a shadowy figure caught my eye, standing near the sidewalk, watching my house. I stiffened. My gut reaction was to grab my phone and check my security feed. The cameras showed the man clearly, Wallace's second-in-command on the HOA board, a man named Greg Carter. He had always been quieter than Wallace, the kind of guy who nodded along but never took the lead. Until now, I stepped off my porch. "Something I can help you with?" I called out. Greg hesitated before stepping forward. "You really made a mess of things," he muttered. I crossed my arms. "By exposing a criminal?" He exhaled sharply. "You don't get it. Wallace was the HOA. He ran everything. Now it's chaos." "Maybe that's a good thing," I said. "Maybe it's time for a fresh start." He chuckled bitterly. "Fresh start? No, what you did, what you exposed. It's going to bring outside attention. Lawyers. Investigations. Do you really think Wallace was acting alone?" That caught me off guard. I had assumed Wallace was a power-hungry control freak. But was there more to it? Greg took another step closer. "If I were you, I'd drop it. Move on. Let things settle." I narrowed my eyes. "Or what?" He gave me a long look before turning away. "Just be careful." That was as much of a warning as I needed. Wallace might have been arrested, but there were still people protecting him. People who didn't want the full truth to come out. And that meant I had to keep pushing, unraveling the corruption. With Wallace gone, the HOA board was scrambling. An emergency meeting was scheduled to elect a new president, and the candidates included Greg Carter and a woman named Lisa Montgomery, a longtime resident who had quietly opposed Wallace, but never had the power to fight him directly. I knew if Greg won, it would be business as usual. If Lisa won, change might actually happen. The problem? The HOA board still consisted of people Wallace had put in place. Even with him gone, they had the power to tilt the vote in Greg's favor. That's when I decided to dig deeper. I started by gathering testimonies. After the HOA meeting where Wallace was exposed, several neighbors approached me, relieved to finally speak freely. The Parkers, who had been forced to move out last year, told me how Wallace had flooded them with so many fines they couldn't keep up with their mortgage. The Johnsons, whose house had mysteriously burned down, mentioned how Wallace had fought their insurance claim, making it nearly impossible for them to rebuild. And then there was Mrs. Caldwell, who had lived here for over 30 years and had seen more than she ever dared to speak about. "He's been taking money," she whispered one afternoon as we sat on her patio. "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning in. "The HOA fees," she said. "For years, he kept increasing them. Said it was for maintenance, security, improvements. But nothing ever changed." I frowned. "Are you saying he was stealing from the HOA?" She nodded. "I never had proof, but I noticed things. Fancy vacations. A brand new car every couple of years. Meanwhile, our community pool has been closed for repairs for the last 5 years. If what she was saying was true, then Wallace wasn't just a power-hungry dictator. He was a fraud. And that meant there had to be financial records, somewhere proving it. Following the money, the next step was getting access to the HOA's finances. Normally, that would be impossible for a regular homeowner, but with Wallace gone and a potential shift in leadership, there was an opening. I reached out to Lisa Montgomery. "You want access to the financial records?" she asked, clearly wary. "I want to know where the money went," I said. "If we can prove fraud, we can make sure Wallace never comes back, and we can clean up this HOA for good." Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "Meet me tomorrow at the clubhouse." The next morning, I arrived early. Lisa had managed to get temporary access to the HOA's financial statements as part of her campaign for presidency. Together, we combed through the records. What we found was staggering. Wallace had been siphoning money from the HOA fund for years. Fake maintenance projects, overpriced consulting, fees paid to shell companies. There were even payments to what looked like a private security firm, though there was no evidence that any real security services had ever been provided. "This is enough to take him down for good," Lisa whispered, shaking her head. "Yeah, I agreed, but we need to make it public." The final showdown. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word spread about Wallace's arrest, and residents were eager to see what would happen next. I sat near the front, laptop in hand, waiting for the right moment. Greg Carter stood up first, making his case for why he should be the new HOA president. He painted himself as the voice of stability, the one who would restore order after the unfortunate misunderstandings that had taken place. Then Lisa stood up. She didn't just make a speech. She presented evidence. She showed the financial records, the missing money, the fraudulent contracts. And then I stood up and played my final card, the security footage I had obtained weeks earlier of Wallace sneaking into my yard, trying to sabotage my cameras. "This is the man who ran this HOA," I said, scanning the crowd. "This is the kind of corruption that was happening right under our noses. Are we really going to let his second-in-command take over?" The room erupted. People shouted. Some HOA board members tried to deflect, but the evidence was undeniable. Then the real bombshell dropped. A woman in the back stood up. "I work for the county attorney's office," she announced, "and I'd like to inform everyone that with this new evidence, we will be launching a full investigation into the HOA's financial activities." That was it, the final blow. The board members who had been in Wallace's pocket resigned on the spot. Greg Carter left the meeting in a hurry, knowing his campaign was over. Lisa Montgomery was unanimously elected as the new HOA president. A new beginning. The days that followed were chaotic. Wallace faced additional charges for financial fraud. Several former board members were investigated. The HOA underwent a massive restructuring, and for the first time, real transparency was introduced. And my security cameras? They stayed right where they were. No one ever questioned them again. As I sat on my porch one evening, sipping a well-earned drink, Mrs. Caldwell walked by and gave me a knowing smile. "You did good," she said. I smiled back. We all did. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I truly belonged in this neighborhood. And I knew Wallace would never control anyone here again.